As part of Health by Design's ongoing commitment to behavioral health education, we present another lesson in our Fundamentals of Weight Management series. Here's the Medical Director of Health by Design, Dr. David Player.
Hello again. Welcome to lecture number 9. This one's going to be a little different than some of our others. You know, last week we spent time looking at food for the first time. If you, just to summarily review, we've been through a couple of food items. We've looked at energy expenditure in terms of physical fitness and physical activity. We've looked at our bodies. We've looked at our tank. We've looked at the things that control calories in and calories out. And you'd think if we know all of this stuff that people would be very successful at diets. And I think certainly if we have good grasp of this stuff, we have a much better chance than if we have no knowledge of our bodies and of physical activity and of food values. But if you look carefully at diet programs around the country, and we all hear ads every day on TV and radio about people who've been successful at a certain kind of diet, and of course success was defined as losing a lot of pounds. But if you look at all those people who've entered diet programs this year, you'll see a startling statistic that just blows you away, and that's that about 95% of all people who enter a diet program this year will be fatter 5 years from now than they were when they entered their diet program. That means only 5% of everybody who goes into any kind of diet program here in this city or any other will ultimately be successful at living life at some new weight or some new composition. And it blows me away. If I took care of high blood pressure like that or diabetes like that, you'd run me out of town on a rail. But somehow we accept the fact that we do diets and we lose weight, but we regain the weight, and somehow that's okay. It must be our fault. And of course you say, well, why would a guy do that? Why would a guy waste a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of time doing something that has an ultimate very high failure rate? And I think the reasons for that are several. When you think about yourself, and I certainly can analyze myself here and say how many times when I've been on a diet, when I'm really on a diet, you know, you can't get me. I go through a phase where I'm getting lots of strokes. People are looking at me and saying, man, you look great. You've lost lots of weight, haven't you? And that makes you feel so good. And all the way down, you get lots of strokes about your diet. You feel real good about yourself. And so there's a lot of positive reasons why you'd lose weight. And in the first place, when you start your diet, think how you felt. Usually it was because somebody had insulted you, or you couldn't get into your clothes, or your doctor told you you had high blood pressure or diabetes, or whatever the heck cause it was. You had very strong impetus to losing weight. Now, think about when you get to your new weight, however. You get down here somewhere where you're starting to feel good about yourself, and now you're living life at the new weight. And how many strokes do you get for living life at a new weight? You know, does anybody walk up to you and tell you, gee, it's nice to see you're still living at that low weight? Shoot, after a while people get used to who you are, and you get no strokes at all to say, hey, you're doing well. And of course that's hard for us. And of course the original things that were out there in the beginning that led to our being fat are still there. And if I could draw the curve that goes so typically in diet centers, you'll see somebody who loses weight like this. And during this particular phase, you could hit a guy in the side of the head with a board and he wouldn't stop his diet. This is somebody who is on a diet, and you know how that is. All of us have been there. Many of you are in that phase right now. And then you get down here to where you're a little bit happier, your clothes are looser, and you're feeling good about yourself, and you've gotten all these good strokes, and you kind of decide you'll live here at this level for a while. This is maybe phase A and phase B. And we've all been at phase B's from time to time. And then some of the things that cause us to eat that have nothing to do with nutrition begin to happen. And we know how that goes. Let's say you had a major stress in your life or major social event. You went on a trip to Europe or any other number of things that sort of forced you out of your plan, and you gained 6 or 7 pounds. Now when you get the 6 or 7 pounds on, you begin to remember what it was like up here. And you say, ooh, I don't want to do that. I've been there before. I've got to get back on my supplement, or I've got to start keeping my records again, or whatever it is you say. Usually it's you get back on diet supplements and you lose about this much, and about the beginning of the second day you don't feel so good, or you say to yourself, gee, this is stupid. I should be able to do this on my own. I should be able to handle this problem, for heaven's sakes. So you get off your supplement, you go back to doing what you're doing, and a month later you're here. and you get back on supplement for a little bit, and then a month later you're here, and you go back on whatever diet it is, and you're here, and 5 years later we see what happens. The patient finally ends up here, fatter, heavier than he or she was when they started their diet program. And of course this is a terrible problem. It's a terrible waste of time, a terrible waste of money, and of course it's one that all of us are concerned about here in being at Health by Design. Now what is it that goes wrong? What is it that takes a guy who's doing so well in phase A, reasonably well in phase B, and puts him over here in phase C, which is a never-ending cycle of weight gain, a little bit of loss, weight gain, a little bit of loss? Well, psychologists who deal with weight loss programs call this problem the failure syndrome. And I guess the fact that psychologists have called it the failure syndrome would make you and me think that it's some kind of a psychologic problem. And yet, as I've told you before, way back in Lecture 2, there really isn't a shred of evidence that this is a psychologic problem, that obesity or body fat storage have anything to do with psychology. In fact, you know, the people who come to Health by Design are not neurotic and they are not psychotic. If anything, they're a little smarter than the general population from an intelligence standpoint. It's well known that psychotherapy is a very ineffective therapy for obesity. So if that's true, the failure syndrome then probably isn't a psychologic illness at all. Since you can't treat it with psychologic methods, it must be something else other than psychologic. And of course we've talked about that before. The problem is not psychologic, it's medical, and it's behavioral. And those are things that sound very different than psychologic illness. Now, so the failure syndrome as a definition, then we have to kind of think of it in a different way. That the failure syndrome is a case where a guy doesn't take his pills. I've thought about that a lot, and I think as we said in Lecture 3 and Lecture 4, this is a basic physiologic problem. It's one that's related to a poor metabolic rate in most of the people who come to Health by Design. And if people understood it as such, they'd have a much better chance of not entering into phase C, this typical weight loss, weight regain cycle. Now I want you to think about some other diseases. If really obesity and the management of body fat are a medical problem of sort, you and I would then have to understand how people manage other diseases. Now let's talk for a second about some other chronic diseases that you may know here in society. The first one is type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes. Let's take diabetes where you have to take insulin. Now a patient who is diagnosed with diabetes is told that if you don't take your insulin, your blood sugar will go out of control and ultimately you'll die. And so the patients who have diabetes get into the habit of every morning, sometimes twice or 3 times a day, taking insulin shots. And as long as they do that, they stay reasonably healthy and their blood sugar stays reasonably good and they're able to live for many, many years. My kidney transplant patients over in the medical center, think about them. You put a new kidney right here and the kidney's alive and well and the kidney tests in the blood are fine as long as the patient continues to take prednisone, cortisone, and Imuran and other kinds of drugs that suppress the immune system. If the patient stops taking those medications, what happens to the kidney? Well, sure, it turns black and it stops working. Clearly, that's a chronic disease where a man must take a therapy. As long as he takes the therapy, he usually does very well and lives a long, long time. Kidney failure, think about that. If somebody told you, Marie, you have kidney failure, you're going to have to be on dialysis for the rest of your life. What is dialysis? Well, it's a machine that cleans out your blood. How often do I have to do it? 3 times a week. 3 times a week? Well, sure, 3 times a week. And you see, and that's a terrible thing for a patient to have to accept. Can you imagine accepting that you had to go into a dialysis center 3 days a week for 4 hours each time, maybe more? It's a very difficult thing, and yet the people who learn to accept it and learn to use the right diets and the things that we ask them to do live a long time. I've had dialysis patients live over 20 years. So clearly it's an acceptance of a medical condition and what needs to be done about it. The final one I was going to talk about is a cardiac arrhythmia. Think of people who take medicines to keep cardiac rhythm stable. Right before the NCAA basketball tournament, we had a college basketball player die who had a chronic cardiac arrhythmia, and was supposed to be taking medicines. And at least what we've heard in the press is that he decided to stop taking his medicines because he didn't feel quite so good or didn't have quite so much energy on the basketball floor. And we, of course, know what happened. He died during a basketball game. And so that's a case, again, of someone who needs to take a chronic medicine to prevent a chronic medical problem. And as long as he takes the chronic medicine, he doesn't get into trouble. So who survives and who does well with these 4 kinds of medical conditions? Well, it's the guys who take their pills, the guys who understand the cause of the disease, and the guys who go back to their doctor and continue to get follow-up to see how they're doing, to look at the basic course and to make sure that the therapy is doing generally well. Those who don't follow up with their doctors don't have any idea how their disease is doing, and they get in trouble, and they ultimately suffer the consequences, sometimes death, sometimes disability, or other things. So based on the first 8 lectures of this series, the things you and I have talked about so far, I think we'd have to say that the failure syndrome is really 4 things. It's a failure to understand the basic process, which is that you have a relatively slow metabolic rate per unit of lean mass. Number 2, that patients who fail to take therapy, whatever the therapy is, and we'll talk about the therapy in a little while. And number 3, that failure is a failure to re-examine the basic process, to re-look at what caused the problem in the first place, and what it is you're doing to solve the basic problem. Let's put up some of those basic graphs again for a second and look at your understanding of the basic process that we've been talking about. The first thing is this issue of energy in versus energy out. Remember, we put it on a teeter-totter, and we said that basically a person who is not gaining fat or losing fat is in energy balance. His energy expenditure is equal to his energy intake. And we divided the energy expenditure into resting metabolic rate and the thermic effect of activity and the thermic effect of food. And your understanding of that gives you a shot at fixing it, at getting therapeutic with it down the line. Now, we said the really fundamental process was, in light of this, that on a distribution curve, people who come to Health by Design, women who come to Health by Design, burn only about 8 times their body weight, 8 times body weight per day. While there are other people out there in society women who burn 13 and 14 times their body weight. And there are some men who burn 10 times their body weight at Health by Design, but there are many men out in society who probably burn 15 or 16 times their body weight. These guys don't come to Health by Design. These people do. There are some poor souls who only burn 5 and 3 times their body weight. Obviously, these people are very fat and have a variety of medical problems. You have to understand this stuff, and you have to understand some of the things that make you and me increase our intake of food that have nothing to do with nutrition. And if we understand that stuff, we have a chance then. It's a basic understanding of a disease process, of a physiologic, biochemical, genetic process. And if we understand it, we have a shot at getting well from it. Now, when do you know then that somebody is entering the failure cycle? When do you know that somebody is in failure? I have a list of symptoms in my notes. Let me pull this out. And you can, on your basic handout, the one that has the picture of the utilization of procedures and the promise or commitment, let's look at some of those things for a second. The list of symptoms that people get when they are entering the failure cycle. The first of these is somebody who comes up to me in clinic and says, "Dave, I'm not losing weight." What's wrong with that? Well, we already know there are lots of people who are losing fat but aren't losing weight. And the scales tells us very little about what we're losing on a weekly basis. So somebody who says to you, "I'm not losing weight," in essence is setting himself up for failure. Maybe it's a woman who's having a menstrual period, maybe it's somebody who's taking Motrin, maybe it's somebody who just ate more salt this week. Whatever it is, weight is not a good index of fat loss. Second one is somebody who comes in and says, "I gained weight." That's a real setup for failure too, isn't it? Think about that. Somebody says that I'm on my diet and I gained weight. Another person came in and says, "Oh, I ate a forbidden food. I said I wasn't going to eat whatever it was, and I ate it." And of course, having eaten it, you say to yourself, "Well, I'm a failure," and that gets people into a failure cycle. Next one is somebody who said, I was going to exercise, but I didn't do any exercise this week, doctor. What a failure I am." Next one, "I overate." Another one there, "I binged. I broke my promise. I was bad." Those are the kinds of things people say when I know they're in danger of getting into the failure cycle. And you can see there on your handout what happens. You set some kind of a promise, and then you didn't make it. You didn't achieve your goal. You define that, as it says, as personal failure. When you're personally failing, of course, how do you feel? Well, you feel bad. Everybody feels bad when they fail, whether they promise themselves or they promise somebody else. It's still a promise. Promise is broken. What happens? How do we feel? We feel bad. When we start feeling bad, what do? Well, one of the best things to do when you're feeling bad is eat. Sure, we go grab something and we eat it. And for a few minutes at least, we feel a little better because eating is therapeutic. It gives us some amines in our brain or some substances that make us feel good. Unfortunately, it's such a short-term relief, as this diagram says, that we then start feeling bad again. And we feel bad, and we eat, and we feel bad, and we eat. And that is the classic failure cycle that patients here get into. That's where you promise something, but you don't live up to your promises, so you get into failure. Now, over here on the other side, look what we do. This is utilization of wise procedures in therapy. You set some realistic goal. You achieve your goal. You define this as success. You feel real positive about it. This encourages you to eat less or to do whatever other things you're doing, and the cycle goes on that way. That's the opposite of a failure cycle. So these are all the verbal symptoms of a failure cycle. There are a couple of physical symptoms of a failure cycle, and I think you know those. Some of you have experienced them already. It's when you had a bad week at home, you did what you said you weren't going to do, or you didn't do what you said you would, and you say to yourself, shoot, I was so bad, I'm not going to go out there to Health by Design. That's a physical symptom of the failure syndrome, somebody who says he was going to show up, but he didn't. And then the other is, of course, somebody who makes kind of a weak excuse for why he wasn't going in. Guy said, you know, well, my dog died yesterday and I just can't make it this week. And so he doesn't show up. That's a guy who's probably gotten into this failure cycle, somebody who's saying, I binged, and heck, if I binged, why should I go out to Health by Design? So you can see those are the kinds of things that people do when they get into failure. Now I want you to pull out one more handout, the little cartoon that shows Kathy on it. Let's look at that for a second. Everybody knows Kathy from the newspaper, and in this particular one, Kathy is going on a diet, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and she says, I will eliminate all fat from my diet. And she holds her hand up and says, I promise. Anybody who says, I promise anything is in danger. At 9:05, however, she says, I will eat some fat, but I will eliminate all sugar from my diet. That's at 9:05. And she's eating probably a peanut butter sandwich or something there that has some fats in it. By 9:15, she says, I will eat sugar in moderation, but will eliminate all processed flour products. Oh, she's 15 minutes into her diet and she's already eating stuff. She's got some jam there and she's thrown it on her bread. By 9:30, she says, I will cut processed flour products to 1 a day, but I will eliminate all non-vegetarian protein sources. Here she is, and she's already got donuts at 9:30. By 10:30, she says, I will be allowed the occasional cheeseburger, but will eliminate all between meal snacks. And she's already had her cheeseburger. She's already into some fats and some protein together. At 11 o'clock, she already says, I will eat small meals at 2-hour intervals, but will eliminate all food except high-fiber grains and vegetables. And of course, we see in the next to the last thing, she rips the thing up and says to herself, I will eliminate this morning from my diet diary. And that's a classic example. We laugh, and that's funny stuff because we've all done that stuff. Is there anybody in here that hasn't done that? I think every one of us have. I think what you see there is that promises get you into failure, but plans get you out. An organized plan gets you out. That bad goals, inadequate goals, I want to lose some weight rather than I want to lose some fat or I want to change my life. The bad goals get you into failure. But understanding this basic physiologic problem, this basic biochemical problem, gives you a shot at getting out. Now, let's go over the therapy. You say, player, what's the plan then? What is the plan that I have to do? How is it that I deal with this problem chronically? And I want you to, let's put these up on the board because I think they're so important. I'll erase your basic physiology here. I think you know what it is by now. And let's put up the plan. There's really 5 or 6 procedures that you and I have to do to stay out of the failure syndrome. And as long as we do these things, we will ultimately not be fat. We will not be in the 95% who fail from this disease. The first of these, and I think you remember some of them already, we've talked about them. The first of them, and probably most important of all, is an increase in activity. And we've defined activity these last several weeks as not being a jock and not doing some kind of exercise necessarily, but moving around more than you used to. And people who come to Health by Design or any other weight program who learn to do increased physical activity on a daily basis, no matter what it is, if it's something that's acceptable to you, will probably have their best shot at not getting into the failure cycle and not regaining weight. The second of these things is accountability. That clearly people who have this problem with low metabolic rate have to chronically answer in some way for their behavior. If they talk to somebody about it every so often, if they know they're coming into a clinic to talk to a physician or a behavioral educator or a nurse or whoever it is, all of us have this behavior that says if I'm going to talk to somebody about it, I have a little better shot at long-term living the life a little better. The third thing is, that's the one we hate the worst, keeping records. Back to Lecture 4, energy balance records. If you and I learn to keep an energy balance record, we will not be fat. You can quote me on that. I think that of all the things that I do that make me think that I will not be fat again in the future, the most important of these is keeping that energy balance record. And most of you are getting very good at that by now. I know you have some concept of foods. There's some things you don't understand yet. There's some things that we haven't gotten to. For instance, next week we'll get into dairy products and meats and some of the first items that have more fat. We still have to talk about condiments. We still have to talk about drinking and so forth. But you know a lot about energy balance already, and many of you are being very effective. So increased activity, accountability, records, energy balance. The fourth is high quality nutrition, and in general that would mean vitamins, minerals, and diet supplements. And remember, your grandparents didn't need to take diet supplements, and the reason they didn't need to take diet supplements because in spite of their having factors of 8 times body weight and 10 times body weight, they moved around so much in their daily lives. They had to chop wood and carry in the ice to the ice box and walk to the outhouse and all the things that our great-grandparents did. They had to do so much stuff that this wasn't quite so important. They ate a lot, so they probably got their vitamins, minerals, and protein. For you and me, with this particular problem in 1990, in a sedentary world that types and answers phones and that kind of stuff, we probably need to be taking some kind of supplements that have high-quality protein with very, very little fat. Finally, the last thing is decreasing addictive foods. And here again, most of the time we simply say you should not be eating items that have high fat, high salt, or high sucrose, high sugar. And we have a lecture coming up in 2 weeks about the addictive aspects of foods and other chemicals that are in foods. And clearly there are many of us who, say for chocolate or for candy or for sometimes flour foods and things like that, act addictively. And if you and I identify the foods that cause us trouble, of course we have a lot better chance of not being fat later on. So these are the 5 most important procedures that keep people out of failure syndrome. If people do these things regularly and make this their plan, not their promise, but their plan, the best data we have says that they will not be in the 95% who have failed on traditional diet programs, but they will be in the 5% who have not failed. I have no doubt that this system works. We have hundreds of patients who are doing very well using it, but there are people who adopt this plan for their life. So in summary, obesity and the management of body composition really are not psychologic issues. If they were psychologic issues, then everybody would have to be treated with psychotherapy, and we'd all be sitting at the psychologist's couch and we'd all be chatting about what happened in our early childhood. And if we understood our early childhood and understood all the stuff that makes up our past, I guess we wouldn't be obese. But the truth is that that doesn't really work, as I've said, because this is not a psychologic problem. This is a medical problem and a behavioral problem related to medicine. In essence, if you learn to take your medicine, if you have good understanding of your disease process, and if you're accountable for long-term follow-up, if you talk about it and you come in and re-examine the process with your physician, and you look at it from time to time, and you follow this basic life plan for how you plan to change, then it seems to me little doubt that you'll be in the 5% and not in the 95%, and you'll be able to stay in phase B for the rest of your life and live life at a new composition. Our job here at Health by Design, of course, is to support you in this, to teach you everything we can about the process, to give you as good an understanding of energy balance and of the kinds of things you should be eating, of giving you a good system of accountability, of encouraging you to be active, and encourage you not to eat addictive foods. If we do our job well and you learn these things, we know that you're going to be successful. Thank you so much.